In the heart of Lagos stood a magnificent hotel called the Golden Palace. The building rose like a mountain of glass and gold reaching toward the sky. Every morning expensive cars lined up in front of the entrance. Rich men and women stepped out wearing designer clothes and shiny jewelry. The hotel was owned by Mr. Richard Okafor, a man so wealthy that people whisper about his money like it was magic. He owned banks, oil companies, and buildings across 3 countries. When he walked into his hotel lobby, everyone bowed their heads and said, "Good morning, sir." Mr. Richard was a tall man with gray hair and serious eyes. He wore suits that cost more than most people earned in a year. His shoes were always polished like mirrors. He had only one weakness in the world, his 7-year-old daughter Chioma. She was his princess's everything. After his wife died 3 years ago, Chioma became the center of his universe. He gave her everything she wanted: toys, clothes, trips to any country she pointed at on the map. But money could not buy the one thing she needed most: a mother's love and attention. The Golden Palace Hotel had over 200 workers. Some worked at the front desk, welcoming guests with bright smiles. Others worked in the kitchen, preparing expensive meals. Some carried luggage and opened doors for rich visitors. But the workers nobody noticed were the cleaners. They came early when the sun was still sleeping. They swept every floor, mopped every surface, and made sure every corner sparkled. Among these invisible workers was a young woman named Grace. She was 28 years old with gentle eyes and hands that worked like magic. Grace had been cleaning the hotel for 2 years, but Mr. Richard had never really seen her. To him, she was just another face in the background, someone who made his world clean while staying out of sight. Grace woke up every morning at 4:30 a.m. in a small one-room apartment in Mushin. The walls were cracked and the roof leaked when it rained hard. She shared this tiny space with her sick mother, who had been bedridden for 8 months. Her mother had kidney problems and needed expensive treatment that Grace could not afford. Every morning, Grace would prepare a small meal for her mother, help her take her medicine, and then rush to catch the first bus to Victoria Island, where the Golden Palace Hotel stood like a castle. At the hotel, Grace worked harder than anyone else. She cleaned 15 floors every day. She scrubbed toilets until they shined like new. She polished windows until they looked invisible. She moved quietly through the hallways like a ghost, making sure rich guests never had to think about dirt or dust. The other workers liked Grace because she was kind and helpful. When someone was tired, Grace would offer to help with their work. When someone was sad, Grace would share her small lunch with them. But Grace never talked about her problems. She never mentioned her sick mother or the medical bills that kept growing like weeds. Every evening, Grace would stop at the pharmacy to buy her mother's medicine. The money she earned at the hotel was barely enough to pay for rent, food, and medical bills. Sometimes she had to choose between buying medicine and buying food. On those days, Grace would go to bed hungry, so her mother could take her pills. She never complained. She never asked for help. She believed that hard work and prayer would somehow make everything better. But deep inside, her heart was breaking. She was losing her mother slowly, and there was nothing she could do to stop it. Every night she would kneel beside her mother's bed and pray for a miracle while tears fell down her face like rain. 7-year-old Chioma lived in a mansion that was bigger than most schools. Her bedroom was like a princess castle with pink walls, golden furniture, and toys from every country in the world. She had dolls that could talk, cars that could drive themselves, and books with pictures that moved like movies. But all these expensive things could not fill the emptiness in her small heart. Since her mother died, Chioma felt like she was living in a beautiful prison. Her father loved her deeply, but he was always busy with meetings, phone calls, and business trips. Chioma spent most of her time alone with house helps who were paid to watch her, but not to love her. They would make sure she ate her meals, did her homework, and went to bed on time. But they could not give her what she needed most: someone to talk to, someone to laugh with, someone to hold her when she had bad dreams about her mother. At school, other children stayed away from her because they knew she was rich. They thought she was proud and different. Chioma wanted friends, but she did not know how to make them. She wanted to play normal games, but other children thought she would not want to get dirty. Every weekend, Mr. Richard would take Chioma to his hotel. He would set up a small office for her in his big office suite. She would color in her books or play with her tablets while he worked on his computer. Sometimes they would eat lunch together in the hotel restaurant. Chioma loved these moments because she had her father's attention. She would tell him about her dreams, her fears, her wishes. But these moments were always cut short by important phone calls or urgent meetings. Chioma learned to be patient. She learned to be quiet. She learned to be invisible, just like the cleaners who worked around her. But inside her heart, she was screaming for someone to truly see her, to truly care about her pain. It was a sunny Saturday morning when Mr. Richard brought Chioma to the hotel as usual. The Golden Palace Hotel had a beautiful swimming pool on the 10th floor with clear blue water that sparkled like diamonds. The pool was surrounded by comfortable chairs and colorful umbrellas. Rich guests would swim and sunbathe while sipping expensive drinks. Chioma loved to sit by the pool and watch the water move like liquid glass. She had learned to swim when she was 5, but she was not allowed to swim alone. Her father had strict rules about her safety. That morning, Mr. Richard was in an important video conference with business partners from London. Chioma sat quietly in his office, coloring in her book and listening to her father speak in serious voices about contracts and investments. After 2 hours, she became restless. She looked at her father, who was completely focused on his computer screen. His forehead was wrinkled with concentration. She knew better than to interrupt him during important meetings. Quietly, she slipped out of the office and walked toward the elevator. She pressed a button for the 10th floor, where the swimming pool waited like a blue jewel. When Chioma reached the pool area, it was empty. The rich guests were probably still sleeping or eating breakfast in their rooms. The water looked so peaceful and inviting. She sat on the edge of the pool and dipped her small feet into the cool water. It felt wonderful against her skin. She looked around to make sure no one was watching then. She slipped into the shallow end of the pool. The water felt like silk around her body. She floated on her back, looking up at the blue sky through the glass ceiling. For the first time in weeks, she felt truly happy. She felt free. She forgot about her loneliness, her father's busy schedule, her mother's absence. She was just a little girl playing in the water like children are supposed to do. Grace was on the 10th floor that morning cleaning the pool area. She had finished mopping the floor around the pool and was now wiping down the chairs and tables. She worked quietly, humming a soft gospel song under her breath. The morning sun was warm on her face, and for a moment she felt peaceful despite all her worries about her mother's health. She was arranging the colorful umbrellas when she heard a small splash from the pool. She looked up expecting to see one of the hotel guests enjoying an early morning swim. Instead, she saw a little Chioma floating in the water. At first, Grace smiled, thinking how lovely the child looked, like a small angel surrounded by blue water. But then something felt wrong. Chioma was floating too still. Her eyes were closed, and her body was not moving the way it should. Grace dropped her cleaning cloth and moved closer to the pool edge. Her heart began to beat faster. Something was definitely wrong. Chioma was not swimming or playing. She was unconscious and sinking slowly toward the deeper end of the pool. Without thinking twice, Grace threw off her cleaning apron and jumped into the pool fully clothed. The water was cold and shocked her system, but she did not care. She swam quickly toward Chioma, who was now completely underwater. Grace dove down and wrapped her arms around the small body. She pulled Chioma to the surface and then to the edge of the pool. Chioma was not breathing. Her lips were blue and her small body was limp like a broken doll. Grace's hands were shaking as she pulled Chioma out of the water and laid her on the pool deck. She remembered the first aid training she had received years ago when she worked at a clinic. She tilted Chioma's head back, opened her airway, and began mouth-to-mouth resuscitation. After what felt like forever, Chioma coughed up water and began to breathe again. Mr. Richard was still in his video conference when his secretary burst into his office without knocking. Her face was pale, and her hands were shaking. "Sir," she said in a trembling voice, "there's been an accident. It's Chioma." Mr. Richard's heart stopped beating. The voices from his computer screen became distant noise. He stood up so quickly that his chair fell backward. "What happened?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. "She was in the pool, sir. She nearly drowned, but she's okay now. She's alive." Mr. Richard ran toward the elevator faster than he had ever moved in his life. His expensive shoes slipped on the marble floor, but he did not care. His hands were shaking as he pressed the elevator button again and again. The elevator seemed to move like a snail, climbing up to the 10th floor. His mind was filled with terrible thoughts. What if he had lost her? What if his only daughter, his only reason for living, was gone? He thought about how he had been so focused on his business meeting that he had not noticed when she left his office. Guilt crashed over him like a giant wave. When the elevator doors finally opened, Mr. Richard ran toward the pool area. He saw a small crowd of hotel staff gathered around something on the pool deck. He pushed through them and saw Chioma lying on a towel, coughing and crying. She was alive. She was breathing. She was the most beautiful sight he had ever seen. He fell to his knees beside her and pulled her into his arms. "Daddy," she whispered, "I'm sorry. I just wanted to swim." He held her so tightly that she could barely breathe. Tears were flowing down his face like rivers. "It's okay, baby," he whispered. "It's okay. Daddy is here now." As Mr. Richard held his daughter, he looked around to understand what had happened. The hotel manager was standing nearby, looking nervous and scared. "Sir," the manager said carefully, "one of our cleaning staff saved her. If she had not been here—" He did not finish the sentence, but Mr. Richard understood. Someone had saved his daughter's life. Someone had given him back his most precious treasure. He looked around and saw Grace standing quietly at the edge of the crowd. Her uniform was dripping wet, and her hair was messy, but her eyes were filled with concern for Chioma. Grace had been trying to stay in the background. She knew that rich people did not like to be bothered by poor workers, especially during emergencies. She had done what needed to be done, and now she wanted to disappear quietly. But Mr. Richard's eyes found hers across the crowd. For the first time in 2 years, he really saw her. He saw the kindness in her eyes, the gentle way she looked at Chioma, the water still dripping from her clothes. He realized that this woman had jumped into the pool without hesitation to save a child she barely knew. "You," Mr. Richard said, standing up while still holding Chioma, "you saved my daughter." Grace nodded, quietly, not sure what to say. She had never spoken directly to the big boss before. "What is your name?" he asked, his voice soft with emotion. "Grace, sir. Grace Adebayo." Mr. Richard looked at her with new eyes. This was not just a cleaner. This was an angel who had been sent to protect his most precious gift. "Thank you," he said simply, but the words carried the weight of his entire heart. Grace smiled and said, "I'm just happy she's safe, sir. That's all that matters." After the paramedics checked Chioma and confirmed she was completely fine, Mr. Richard asked Grace to stay. He wanted to talk to her privately. They sat in his office while Chioma slept on the comfortable couch wrapped in soft blankets. Mr. Richard studied Grace's face, trying to understand who this woman really was. She sat quietly with her hands folded, waiting for him to speak. Her wet uniform was starting to dry, but she still looked uncomfortable in the luxurious office. "Tell me about yourself, Grace," Mr. Richard said gently. Grace was surprised by the question. Rich people never ask poor workers about their personal lives. She hesitated for a moment, then spoke softly. "I live with my mother, sir. She's very sick. I work here to pay for her medical treatment." Mr. Richard leaned forward, interested. "What kind of sickness?" he asked. Grace's eyes filled with tears, but she did not let them fall. "Kidney problems, sir. She needs dialysis twice a week and medication every day. I'm trying to save money for a kidney transplant, but it's very expensive." As Grace spoke, Mr. Richard saw something he had never noticed before. Behind her quiet demeanor was a woman carrying an enormous burden. She worked long hours cleaning his hotel, not because she loved the job, but because she was fighting to keep her mother alive. She was a warrior disguised as a cleaner. "How long has she been sick?" he asked. 8 months, sir. She used to work as a tailor, but now she can't even stand up for long periods. I'm all she has." Grace's voice cracked slightly, but she quickly composed herself. Mr. Richard felt something stirring in his chest. This woman had her own problems, her own pain, but she had still risked everything to save his daughter. When Chioma woke up from her nap, she saw Grace sitting quietly in the corner of her father's office. The little girl's eyes lit up with recognition. "You're the lady who saved me," she said with a bright smile. Grace smiled back and nodded. Chioma got up from the couch and walked over to Grace. Without any hesitation, she climbed onto Grace's lap and hugged her tightly. "Thank you for helping me," she whispered. Grace felt her heart melt. No child had hugged her like this in years. "You were very brave," Grace said softly, stroking Chioma's hair. "But you scared your daddy very much. You should not go swimming alone." Chioma nodded seriously, then looked up at Grace with curious eyes. "Are you a mama?" she asked innocently. Grace's breath caught in her throat. "No, sweetheart. I don't have children." Chioma tilted her head thoughtfully. "My mama went to heaven when I was little. I don't remember her very much. But you feel like a mama when you hug me." Mr. Richard watched this interaction with growing emotion. His daughter, who was usually shy around strangers, was completely comfortable with Grace. There was something magical happening between them, something that money could not buy. Chioma looked at her father, then back at Grace. "Daddy," she said with the pure honesty that only children possess, "why do you look sad, Grace? Your eyes look like mine when I miss my mama." Grace was stunned by the child perception. How could a 7-year-old see what adults missed? Grace looked at little Chioma and then at Mr. Richard. The child's innocent question had opened a door that Grace had tried to keep locked. She felt tears gathering in her eyes despite her efforts to stay strong. "I'm not sad, sweetheart," she said softly to Chioma. "I'm just worried about my mama. She's sick, and I wish I could make her better." Chioma's eyes grew wide with understanding. "Is your mama in the hospital?" she asked. Grace nodded, unable to speak for a moment. "I know how that feels," Chioma said with wisdom beyond her years. "When my mama was sick, I felt scared all the time. I wanted to help her, but I was too small." She paused and looked at Grace with pure compassion. "But you're not too small. You saved me today. Maybe God will help you save your mama too." The simple faith in the child's voice broke something inside Grace. Tears began to flow down her face, and she could not stop them. All the months of being strong, of pretending everything was okay, of carrying her burden alone suddenly became too heavy. Mr. Richard watched his daughter comfort this woman who had risked her life to save her. He saw Grace crying and realized that heroes were not always strong people who never showed weakness. Sometimes heroes were people who were breaking inside, but still found the courage to help others. "Grace," he said gently, "tell me exactly what your mother needs. Don't leave out any details." Grace wiped her tears and began to explain about the kidney transplant, the medical bills, the specialist doctors, the medications. As she spoke, Mr. Richard made a decision that would change both their lives forever. The next morning, Mr. Richard called Grace into his office again. This time his lawyer was present along with his personal assistant. Grace felt nervous, wondering if she was in trouble for crying in front of the boss the day before. But Mr. Richard's expression was kind, not angry. "Grace," he said, "I want to help your mother. I want to take care of all her medical expenses, including the kidney transplant." Grace stared at him in shock, unable to believe what she was hearing. "Sir," she stammered, "I cannot accept such a huge gift. I have nothing to give you in return." Mr. Richard smiled and shook his head. "You gave me everything when you saved my daughter's life. You gave me back my reason for living. No amount of money can repay that debt." He handed her an envelope. "This contains contact information for the best kidney specialist in Nigeria. I've already spoken to him about your mother's case. He will see her tomorrow morning at Lagos University Teaching Hospital." Grace opened the envelope with trembling hands. Inside was a letter from a world-renowned specialist and a check for an amount of money she had never imagined seeing in her lifetime. "I don't understand, sir," she whispered. "This is too much. I'm just a cleaner." Mr. Richard stood up and walked around his desk to stand in front of her. "Grace, you are not just a cleaner. You are the woman who taught my daughter and me what real love looks like. You showed us that a person's worth is not measured by their bank account, but by the size of their heart." Grace's mother, Mama Adebayo, could not believe her eyes when the private ambulance arrived at their small apartment in Mushin. She was gently transferred to a comfortable stretcher and driven to the most expensive hospital in Lagos. For months she had been preparing to die, knowing that her daughter could not afford the treatment she needed. But now she was being wheeled into a medical facility that looked like a palace with clean white walls, modern equipment, and doctors who spoke to her with respect and kindness. The kidney specialist, Dr. Johnson, examined Mama Adebayo thoroughly and confirmed that she was a good candidate for transplant surgery. "We need to find a matching donor," he explained to Grace, "but I'm optimistic about her chances. Her general health is better than I expected." Within a week, a perfect match was found from the hospital's donor program. The surgery was scheduled immediately. Grace sat in the waiting room for 6 hours, praying and crying and hoping for the miracle she had dreamed about for so long. When Dr. Johnson emerged from the operating room with a smile on his face, Grace knew that God had answered her prayers. "The surgery was successful," he announced. "Your mother will need time to recover, but she should be able to live a normal, healthy life." Grace fell to her knees right there in the hospital corridor and thanked God with all her heart. 2 weeks later, when Mama Adebayo was strong enough to walk, Grace brought her to meet Mr. Richard and Chioma. "This man saved your life, Mama," Grace said with tears of joy. Mama Adebayo held Mr. Richard's hands and blessed him with words that made even the billionaire cry. Mr. Richard offered Grace a new position as Chioma's personal nanny and companion. The salary was 10 times what she earned as a cleaner and came with a beautiful apartment near his mansion, so she could be close by whenever Chioma needed her. Grace accepted the job, but not for the money. She accepted it because she had fallen in love with the lonely little girl who needed a mother figure in her life. Chioma was overjoyed to have Grace as her constant companion. Finally, she had someone who truly understood her heart. Grace and Chioma became inseparable. They would spend hours talking about everything and nothing. Grace would braid Chioma's hair and tell her stories about brave princesses and kind queens. Chioma would help Grace learn how to use a computer and teach her English words she had never heard before. They would cook together, laugh together, and pray together. For the first time since her mother's death, Chioma felt like she had a family again. And for the first time in her adult life, Grace felt like she had a daughter to love and protect. Mr. Richard watched this beautiful friendship develop, and realized that saving Chioma from drowning was not the only miracle Grace had performed. She had also saved his daughter from loneliness and despair. She had brought laughter back into their home. She had shown them both what it meant to love unconditionally. One evening, as he watched Grace and Chioma reading a bedtime story together, he made another decision. He called his lawyer and began the process of legally adopting Grace as Chioma's guardian, so that no matter what happened, his daughter would always have the mother she deserved. 6 months after the swimming pool incident, Mr. Richard was sitting in his garden watching Grace and Chioma play with soap bubbles in the afternoon sun. His mother, who had been healthy and strong for months now, was sitting beside him, knitting a small sweater for Chioma. The scene was perfect, peaceful, and filled with the kind of joy that money could never buy. As the sun began to set, Chioma ran over to her father with grass stains on her dress and happiness glowing in her eyes. "Daddy," she said, climbing onto his lap, "I want to tell you something important." Mr. Richard smiled and held her close, wondering what profound thought his 7-year-old daughter had discovered now. Chioma looked at Grace, who was cleaning up their play area, then looked back at her father with serious eyes. "I know why God took my first mama to heaven," she said quietly. Mr. Richard's heart skipped a beat. This was a conversation they had never had before. "Why is that, sweetheart?" he asked gently. Chioma smiled and pointed at Grace. "Because he knew that Grace's mama needed to get better, and Grace needed us, and we needed Grace. So he made everything happen at the right time. My first mama sent Grace to save me from the water, and then Grace saved all of us from being sad." She paused and looked up at her father with wisdom that took his breath away. "God doesn't make mistakes, Daddy. He just makes miracles that look like accidents." Mr. Richard felt tears streaming down his face as he held his daughter and looked at Grace, who had become the missing piece of their family puzzle. In that moment, he understood that true wealth was not measured in billions of dollars, but in the love that surrounded him. Grace had started as a poor cleaner begging God for a miracle to save her mother's life, but in the end, she had become the miracle that saved them all. Sometimes God answers prayers in ways we never expect, turning ordinary people into angels and transforming broken hearts into families filled with love.